G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and I hope that you have had as good of a weekend that I have had. I was interstate celebrating my last remaining grandparents' 90th birthday and I had a fantastic time, and thank you for the messages that people reached out wishing him a happy birthday as well. Now, of course, legends, today we have a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to look at maps. Of course, the title of this video, I think, is going to be about some fundamental issues in Western weapons and the procurement there, and what can be done to solve this as well, and what Ukraine has told us about attritional war, what it has shown us, although we should have known this. And I'll go over some doctrine which basically states this has been clear for many, many years. And then we need to go over the loss of an F-16 and sadly the pilot as well, recruiting issues, and also the coalition of the willing and how that has fallen apart before it really got off the ground. And where I want to start is actually with that. This is a bit of our miscellaneous folder before we get into the maps and compare it and some geolocations and everything, is that an F-16 has been lost. Now, remember, we don't go off speculation of aircraft losses. We either go by self-confirmation or by images. But the Air Force of the Ukrainian Air Force here on their page, they have confirmed that an F-16 and the pilot have then gone down, and sadly the pilot losing his life, this Mr. Pavlo Ivanov. Now, this is all the information we really have at this point in time. According to a BBC source, and it said in total, Russians fired 3 missiles at the plane. It was either a guided anti-aircraft missile from the S-400 ground-based complex or an R-37 air-to-air missile. So it was either surface-to-air air defense, or it was then another plane has taken this down. We may know more in time. I'm waiting on a confirmation from fighter bomber if it was another fighter aircraft that took that out. But again, we will wait and see with any aircraft, because of course there's a lot of misinformation always floats around out there, and you never know, maybe it was taken down by a tin of baked beans and someone with a fantastic throwing arm. Now, what we know is one of the biggest friction points, and I believe a much larger friction point than people like to actually take notice of, is Ukraine is not lowering the age of conscription. And I think that this is a huge, huge sticking point for, we know it was for Biden, but I believe it's even larger for the Trump administration. Now, of course, Zelensky doesn't want to lower that due to demographic issues, which does make sense, but it doesn't make sense in an existential war. Therefore, we call this the manpower paradox. So instead, Syrskyi, Zelensky, all those in that upper echelon have been focusing on trying to recruit 18 to 24-year-olds. And we don't know how successful this has or hasn't been until today, that the deputy head of Ukraine's president's office, Mr. Pelisa, he has said this, that about 500 young volunteers have signed the contract. Of course, this came with special benefits, but 500 is a very concerning figure. That is very, very low. We know that Russia is still recruiting in the tens of thousands month after month and is well above replacement, as we have seen the numbers grow on the battlefield. Ukraine, they need tens to hundreds of thousands more men who are trained to be able to not only move the front, but in hopes at very best, at the very minimum, to stabilize the front line. Because if it's not stable, if it's continuing that grind, I can't see why Putin would come to the table. And if he does, Trump is going to look at it and go, well, this is continually grinding forward as well. So more of what has been said here, that he looks that there should be something more like what occurs in Israel with national service. If a citizen is truly a citizen and claims to receive a position, education, or any payments from the state budget, he or she must serve, as he says, a minimum contract for both men and women. So maybe we will see something like this. Realistically, if you could turn back the clock, and of course, hindsight is the foresight of arseholes, but day one, you would have mobilized absolutely everyone you could have. And I still can't believe that isn't taking place, not only because Ukraine has a manpower crisis and an aging military, but also just a signal to the countries supporting Ukraine that if you are willing to support us, we are willing to mobilize the resources needed to continue supporting ourselves. And that messaging to the US, I think maybe behind closed doors, is incredibly powerful and is really shifting of how that Trump administration may see things. Now, the coalition of the willing, or as I would probably refer to it, the coalition of the rhetoric, because however long, whatever it takes is the rhetoric, actions, they don't line up to that. And apparently the talks have already failed. From the EU chief, my favourite person and lord of diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, that different member states have different opinions and the discussions are still ongoing. Now, pages have said this is despite 200 military experts from 30 countries working on a strategy for Ukraine's sky, sea and land, but disagreements have stalled the plan. And that is exactly the issue. And that's the exact issue with any coalition like this, is if you don't have a main country heading that up, like the coalition in Afghanistan of the US, if you don't have one country, if everyone's coming in with the same amount of power, you get, quote, too many chiefs, and everyone is never going to agree on something, so it's just going to stall and never move. Why do you think diplomacy and bureaucracy stall anything that you want in a coalition, say like the EU? So what's going to have to happen here is someone, probably Germany, it should be Germany, because France and the UK, they don't have the industrial output to head that up, and that they are ultimately responsible for it. But again, we don't know. Kaja Kallas was asked on Friday whether the gathering a day before in Brussels had cleared up any confusion over the stalled plans, and she has said no, that the meeting had shed light on the strategy to police any peace settlement. The different member states have different opinions and the discussions are still ongoing. These remarks were dismissed by John Healey, the Defence Secretary, who said the Franco-British-led coalition's plans were real and well advanced. So we don't really know where that is sitting. And before we get into the maps, I want to talk about something you and I have spoken about at length, which is the difference between traditional NATO doctrine, Soviet doctrine, and the elements of wanting to win a decisive short war and protracted attritional war, and where those doctrines excel and where they have problems as well. And flexibility is a big part in this. And this has become more mainstream today, with this being shared by German media and this gentleman here, who is a journalist and the chief European political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. We'll go over the article on doctrine. So, German weapon systems donated to Ukraine have issues. They either need too much maintenance because of the intensity of fighting, or the ammunition is too expensive. The systems that perform the best are decades old and no longer used in Germany. The Gepard, the self-propelled anti-aircraft gun that can take down anything from drones to jets to missiles. The Marder and IFV both were developed in former West Germany, a Cold War top nation. Now, this is in line with exactly what we have been saying, is that you have a simpler bit of equipment, maintenance is easier and cheaper, crews or people operating the system are much quicker to train, and if you lose those troops in a war of attrition, it is easier to retrain and replace other than citizens to move onto those systems. Quantity is a quality of its own, but the quality and complexity of Western systems is actually their biggest issue as well. I am a former Western soldier. I served in an infantry unit, and we have some of the greatest systems in the world. The thing is, it takes years and years to be competent on some of those, and in a war of attrition where you have massive turnover of troops, that doesn't work. You need to be able to not only replace losses, but increase the size of your forces quickly too. So before we go over specifically what the Germans are saying, let's have a look over the doctrine here, and something which I've shared before you may have seen. But this is of attritional war. We'll talk about the economic dimension, that wars of attrition are won by economies enabling mass mobilisation of militaries via their industrial sectors. Armies expand rapidly during such conflict, requiring massive quantities of armoured vehicles, drones, electronic products, and other combat equipment. Because high-end weaponry is very complex to manufacture and consumes vast resources. A high-low mixture of forces and weapons is imperative in order to win. And this high-low mixture, this is something you've heard me speak about with troop training too. You need a mixture of high and low. And those high-end forces with higher-end weapons need to go frontline to frontline to stabilise actions, while the lower-end forces that can be replaced more quickly, they need to hold lines to gain experience before coming those higher end formations as well. High-end weapons have exceptional performance, but are difficult to manufacture, especially when needed to arm a rapidly mobilized army, subject to a high rate of attrition. This example here in World War II was the German Panzers. These are superb tanks. A German Panzer one-on-one with a T-34 would absolutely fucking smoke it. But the difference was the Soviets are rolling out 8 per every one of them. Again, the quality of these, don't compare it at all. But the quantity is a quality of its own. And we know the end of the Second World War's outcome here. The difference in performance did not justify the numerical disparity in production. High-end weapons also require high-end troops. You need a lot of training on these. Therefore, maintenance is very high. When we're talking about the Germans, think about buying a Toyota or a Kia compared to a Mercedes or an Audi. These take significant time to train. Time which is unavailable in a war with high attrition rates. And this has been one of my main criticisms about Western vehicles, some Western vehicles to Ukraine. I have gone, instead of wanting the optics of giving Abrams and giving fucking 10 of them, no, take the money that would cost and buy T-Series tanks that are already being operated somewhere else and move them in, even if you're buying them from fucking whoever. Optically, who gives a shit? Optics don't win wars. Yeah, anyway, it is easier and faster to produce large numbers of cheap weapons and munitions, especially if their subcomponents are interchangeable with civilian goods. So civilian factories could build some parts of them, ensuring mass quantity without the expansion of production lines. And of course, these subcomponents, this is a big part too. So between your T-Series tanks, a lot of components are similar, even between the tanks and the IFVs and the bodies and all of that. Now, Rheinmetall does have this as well between some of the AEPC, IFV, then variants too. But what we're seeing in Ukraine, and this is one of the big problems, is we're seeing all sorts of Leopards. We're seeing Abrams, we're seeing T-Series tanks, we're seeing Challengers, and we're seeing everything fucking in between. The Western nations would have been far better off not wanting a hand-shandy-a-thon dick measuring contest of tanks, going, look, we're not going to deliver 10 systems. Hey, Germany, why don't we backfill your Leopards? We'll give you some Abrams or something, rather than just wanting to hang a flag and wave it, which is what a lot of these leaders would rather do than actually equipment to win. Remember, we're talking here about attritional wars are won by enabling mass mobilization and troops to use that equipment as well. New recruits. So what we're seeing Ukraine struggle with at the moment, we talked about that recruiting, or conscripted soldiers too, also absorb simpler weapons faster, allowing rapid generation of new formations and the reconstitution of existing ones. So the simpler the system, the easier it is to get a guy actually proficient and on the front line. Achieving mass is difficult for higher end Western economies. To achieve hyper efficiency, they shed excess capacity and struggle to rapidly expand, especially since lower tier industries have been transferred abroad for economic reasons. So much of our industry has gone overseas. Big issue when we talk about China and sanctions, but we'll digress on this and say the thing is, with private companies, they are wanting to make as much money as possible. So they shed excess capacity for then hyper efficiency too, that they're just trying to bring that down. It makes sense, but in wartime it's very difficult, because then you're trying to get a private company on a war that does have an end at some point to then increase. So what you're going to do is pay a lot more per item. I think we need a full overhaul of the whole military industrial complex. Force generation. So this is from the industrial output to actually generating that forces. So industrial output exists so it can be channeled into replacing losses and generating new formations. This requires appropriate doctrine and command and control structures. The two main models in play is NATO, so the West, and the old Soviet model, which the Russians started the war with, and they're moving into a bit of a hybrid in between. But we knew that would happen. NATO armies are highly professional, backed by non-commissioned officers, NCOs, who have a lot of individual initiative and a lot of leeway, so you can do small team tactics really, really well. And this then gives tremendous agility and flexibility to exploit opportunities on a dynamic battlefield, say as the successes in areas like Afghanistan in small platoon section dynamic battlefields of the movement. The thing is, the rate of losses was very, very low compared to a war like this. In attritional war, this method has a downside. The officers and NCOs required to execute this doctrine require extensive training and, above all, experience. A US Army NCO takes years to develop. Good NCOs, minimum of like 5 years in the job to actually understand and put this into action on the battlefield. Again, the thing is, in attritional war, with heavy casualties, this is what attritional war is characterised by, there simply isn't time to replace these lost NCOs or generate them from new units. And exactly the same for these complex systems. If you lose a systems operator of a very complex system, you're just not going to have someone to replace that, or him or her, very quickly. The Soviet system, on the other hand, wasn't as flexible as the Western system. Therefore, the personal and lower end initiative wasn't there in dynamic battlefields. But if it is in a large-scale conflict, say with NATO, is what it was built for, they are more able to rapidly expand by calling up massed reserves, that everyone or a lot of the men have some level of basic training so you can move that up quicker. But they have an absence of reliable NCOs. This in turn create an officer-centric command model. This is less flexible than NATO, but more adaptable to large-scale expansion required by attritional warfare. And we saw this in the beginning with some of those more dynamic operations really fall flat because of that command model. But in the doctrine, and we've known this for a long time, as the war progresses past a year mark, frontline units will gain experience as an improved NCO corps is likely to emerge, giving the Soviet model then greater flexibility than it once had. And this is something that you would have seen if you watched my videos for a while, that I was getting information off the front line on, is one of the guys fighting for Ukraine that I keep in touch with has said the biggest thing that I have noticed, he said, was personal initiative on the battlefield, that the NCOs now, they can actually, the Russian NCOs can actually withdraw from areas if they see that it's going to be unsuccessful. And he was saying that was the biggest shift he'd seen around the Bakhmut-Chasiv Yar area about a year ago. And this is what we get, is the Western system, it starts stronger but weakens over time as the replacement can't keep up with the incredibly complex systems and the complex doctrine as well, where the Soviet system starts weak and strengthens throughout as experience is gained. Now, of course, this is different from protracted and decisive victory, and we are very focused on having a decisive victory, but this scares me if in a potential attritional protracted war with China. Now, this is the actual article here through German news, that hardly any large equipment is fully suitable for war, that there are major problems with modern large-scale equipment according to the internal Bundeswehr document attained by NDR and WDR, that what does this actually mean for future military procurement? And this is the problem. By increasing capacity in a private system, it's going to increase the cost per unit. They have to hire more people, tool up, all of this. And it's very hard to do while Europe is convinced that they are in peacetime and only supporting a country in war rather than at a lukewarm, cold war at this point in time. So they're saying we're not at war when, get over yourselves, you are. If Iran is at war there, you are as well. You can't be supplying all of this in and ISR and everything and flying jets around or whatever and say that you're not. You sort of pull your finger out of your ass and go, look, it's going to cost us a fair bit more money. But the problem is in private companies like this, and just the way military procurement works, it rewards research and development over mass. This is the difference between public and private sectors on this. We see the same. I'll talk about oil tomorrow for a bit of this too. Technical vulnerability and too little ammunition. So this weapon here, the Panzer whatever 2000, this is a self-propelled gun. Such a high technical vulnerability that its suitability for military use is seriously questioned. So a great system, but it's so technical, its actual suitability on the front line when you're going to be in very tough conditions is questioned. Leopard 105, this is a Cold War era tank, is considered reliable and is often used as a makeshift artillery due to its weak armour. So it's reliable but used in a different way. The newer Leopard 2A6 is expensive to repair, and field repairs and repairs at the front, this isn't possible because it's so hard. You can fix your Toyota Land Cruiser in the backyard. You can fix your Leopard 1A5. You can't fix your BMW X5. They're too fucking busy tailgating you at 120 down the road. The IRIS-T, which is an air defence system, it's very effective, but the price of ammunition, it's too high, and it is not available in sufficient quantities. The Patriot air defence system is also fundamentally an excellent weapon system, but unsuitable for combat use because the carrier is too old and the manufacturer can no longer supply spare parts. Again, there's just not the mass of it as well, and very, very complex too. I'm not saying that it's not fantastic, but if you only have X amount of rockets, eventually they'll start leaking through. According to the minutes in here that was then obtained, the conclusion is also complex equipment remains unused. The operational value of ultra-modern and complex large-scale equipment is low if troops cannot carry out repairs on site. And this is what we see, that ultra-modern equipment not being used, going to the older stuff that is reliable, that is being used, that there's enough of it. And this is my primary concern against a protracted conflict with someone like China. We focus on ultra-modern equipment in small numbers and a quick, decisive victory. And our exercises show this. Our exercises go for a few weeks for a decisive victory. The problem is, if that doesn't happen, if China can just survive the first few weeks, they will then continue to wear us down. And a lot of that ultra-modern equipment then will be too difficult to repair. There's not going to be enough of it, or then down to all the satellites going to be out, and it may just be like the Excalibur shells. Fantastic shell, GPS is jammed, expensive as fuck shells that are doing the same job as a dumb shell, but in far, far fewer numbers. So a little bit more here. Mass, high tech is needed. However, this does not mean that we should fundamentally forego even high-tech weapon systems in the future. This is from a general here, who I'm sure will get picked up on a 10x salary from being a general into the military-industrial complex. But he is right. We shouldn't just fundamentally forego this. One, German's industry would fall apart for Rheinmetall. But secondly, you need that high-end mixed with low-end. The problem is, fundamentally, Western militaries is focused purely in super high-end technology. We can see on shells, North Korea outpaced the West. Okay, that should be alarm bells going off. While older weapon systems are often more reliable in real-world operations, well, real-world operations probably matter more than, bloody make-believe exercises, but he believes that we must be more modern in future war scenarios. We need both mass and high-tech. The war in Ukraine, according to the former general, illustrates how important the future use and defence of drones and reconnaissance in the electromagnetic field, radios and signals will be. Now, I don't disagree with what he's saying, but you are never going to have, there's not enough money in the world to have only high-tech and all of that at mass. You don't have enough. No one can recruit people to join the militaries in the first place, so problem. There has to be a mix of high-tech and a mix of mass as well, and we just can't focus on the NGAD without having, we still need a lot of other fighter aircraft. We can't just focus on the best infantry units we still just need a lot of guys manning positions, and that's my biggest gripe as a former soldier in a very professional army is we are too professional to actually mobilise the amount of forces. And if you ask me to train this guy on our tactics, I can't do it in 3 months. An important conclusion from Ukraine warns Green Party defence politicians, I'm sure the Green Parties know all about this, is that due to the high failure rate of equipment, more weapon systems simply need to be available. But it is also clear that we can no longer think in terms of such small quantities, but rather must assume that vehicles have a long downtime even after damage, during which they simply need to be serviced. So I do agree, you need to think of quantity as well. And if you ask me, what has Ukraine struggled with? Have they struggled with Western technology? No. A lot of it has been available. They've struggled with mass. Have they struggled with training of troops? To a degree, but the reason for that is there's not enough mass to actually have guys rotate off the front to train as well, where the Russians probably go too far the other way. They've got so much mass that a lot of the training, everything, especially in the first 2 years, wasn't there, and we just saw pile-ups of convoys. But as we showed you, that Soviet system, it adapts over time and actually can then increase the lethality on more complex military operations as well. Legends, we're going to look at the maps. About time. Here we have Ukraine in the centre, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the red check that you will see. Of course, these are areas that have been occupied by the Russian forces since the last 24 hours. Oh my God, I got mixed up where I was. Now, let's come into Kursk, of course, where Ukraine crossed from Sumy into Kursk, and this has then reduced in size even more. So we have from the 12th, which this was at 55.6 all up, but it was still connected down here to then today. You can see this decrease, and we have one section of 26 and one of 10. So you're about 36 square kilometres, and that is 36 square kilometres of what was once 1,000 and really was about 600 and fell over the past few weeks. But I'm less interested in that and more interested in what is happening around Zurivka up here. So we did show you a geolocation last time we spoke, and this grey zone has expanded across the border in here, as well as this green has gone down. And this crossing in here, which at this point in time, if Russia does occupy this grey zone in here, is more than Ukraine holding Kursk. Problem for negotiations, Mr. Zelensky, but further operations into Sumy as well, if Russia can actually launch larger scale attacks. So let's move then into the north of then the occupied areas, the northeast. We have Kamyanka, Petrivka areas I'm sure you are familiar with. Let's look on this one first off from Suryak maps. Now, these are never the easiest things to line up because none of the paddocks make bloody sense. But what we can see is Kamyanka here, this is this red dot, that there's been more crossing in and around this area. Again, this is an area I say keep an eye on. It's slow. It did go pretty rapid in the beginning, but I believe this, as far as strategic significance, maybe as even just a draw away for forces, very, very important. Then just south of here, we have what I refer to as the Pishani front around this Kolesnikivka, and this is our Northeast 2 map. Again, not the greatest labelling, but we can see a grey zone in here. Surak saying that this is red right about this then plot of trees in here as well. So we can get rid of all of those. Now, we'll continue moving our way down. If we miss a couple of areas, I apologise. We see south of Terny, red check on this map towards Yampalivkia. Remember, Suryak has shown that this is basically something like this at this point in time. But we do see an increasing control there, so we know there was definitely movement. Bilohorivkia hasn't shifted, although Suryak has said that it has. Chasiv Yar. Now, I believe this map actually shows more Russian control than is actually taking place in Chasiv Yar at this point in time. We have a Suryak map on this, and I'm not going to show you it, but this is confirmed as well, along with AMK mapping, that there has been Ukrainian pushes back in and have seized buildings in some of these sectors as well. Now, it's hard to see because these show different, but just around in this sector where my cursor is in here, that this has come back under control of the Ukrainian forces. But in the center here, that Russia has gained more areas. Again, there's been a lot of liquidity, fluid movements happening in Chasiv Yar. We'll continue our way down, and the next place we'll get to then is Toretsk. And we can see, ignore south of here, no movement in Toretsk, but we come to the Suryak maps, and he says this: the Russian army made new advances northwest of Druzhba, so Druzhba movement up in this sector. In addition, Russian forces increased the attacks towards positions of the Ukrainian army in the Fomonkia district, so right in the center. Again, Toretsk, we're waiting for some geolocations to figure out what is actually going on. Now, we come then really into the Pokrovsk sector. Now, we can see south of Sukabalka that the Russian forces have made it up to this road. Now, I believe this is about a week old update, unless Mr. Suryak has a crystal ball. Otherwise, give me some tips for the horses, mate. What we see is moving up this road. He's shown that for about a week. But of course, this does then limit supply of one of the main service routes in this sector. Suryak maps, he's showing this. Now, we have a couple of maps from himself. So, towards Kalinove, that there has been Russian advancement, as well as Russian advancement up around this road to the west of Alexander Pil. That was the update yesterday. Then the most recent update is then movement to the south, but all the way up to this road in the south here, moving to the north, movement all the way around Kalinove, all the way up to then the Baranivkia front line, where it starts to cut down in here. So there's been a lot of movement that Surak is showing around in this sector. And we have seen the Russian forces allocating a lot of resource just to this sector. And I do have a geolocation to show today that is more in line with what Surak Maps is showing. So this arrow here, this is right where my cursor is here. I'll move around so you can see it. We see then this video here, if I can bring that up, of then Russian forces planting then a unit flag on top of a destroyed building here, but confirming that there is presence there. It's grey zone, but when you're putting up flags in areas, I would dare say it's probably red at that point in time. But then we are going to move. Did I have an update from yesterday in here? Apologies. I stepped forward a little bit. If we step back to yesterday and turn this on, we can see the confirmation of the movement around Kalinove to line up with Surak, as well as that Baranivkia movement as well up to today. That makes more sense. Move Pokrovsk front line. You see a little bit of blue in here, but that's not recent. That's over the past few days and weeks. But if we step back to yesterday, you will see some movement in here on the direction of this Kotlanivkia as well. We sort of see this like hump coming out here. That's the best way to get an idea when we show you then the Surak maps of where we're actually talking about. Now, this is right in here where that grey zone was they show the red check is being shown, but just south of here, you can see there's apparently advances by the Russian forces as well, expanding this hump, we'll call it in here, as well as they continue assaults in and around Lysivkia and Kotliny. And this is Lysivkia in here and Kotliny up here. Assaults, of course, we've seen Ukraine take back some ground in those sectors more recently as well. Then we come up to today's map, and we do see some significant shifts on what we are calling the hump in here. So let's have a look. Now, the Russian army managed to take up new positions to the south and west of Zaporizhia. Remember that Zaporizhia sits down in here, not the oblast, the town. In addition, Russian forces entered the eastern part of Trotsky and advanced northwest of this one right in here. So northwest of here, and really just leveling up the front line down in this sector. So keep an eye on this, as this is going to play into this gap we see in Andriivka, Constantinople at the moment. I saw a page and someone who calls himself a military analyst saying, oh, Russia's horseshoe tactics, because they can't assault on Ukrainian positions, they're instead enveloping positions. Firstly, if you've just come to this realization, fucking welcome to the club, welcome to the war for the past 3 years. But secondly, yeah, that's what you do, is you go for the weaker spots of your enemy's logistics to then try and cut that off rather than going up the guts. It has nothing to do with then, you know, this dick measuring contest of whatever. It's the tactics of what's being done. I don't see how that is analysis if you've just come to this envelopment of positions now. Anyway, it pisses me off when I see people who are 10 to 20 times larger than I, who have this like new epiphany of, oh my God, this tactic. You're like, brother, what? Anyway, let's talk about Velika Novosibirsk. Now, no changes in here for the past couple of days. Of course, this is Velika down in here, and then we have Shevchenko area, as well as areas pushing out of Rozdolny too. During the last 5 days, Russian army managed to take a number of positions beyond the first defensive line of Rozdolny. So behind, you can see the blue in here, behind the defensive lines in Rozdolny. And that is an issue. In the direction of this. In addition, Russian forces took new positions east and southeast of Shevchenko. So again, this is showing that they're getting very, very close day by the Russian forces. So north of this Privneny in here, coming up on Shevchenko, again, where that defensive line sits also. So keep an eye on that. No changes shown down in the south. Again, still behind on some geolocations in there. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.